It was just a family portrait, until the historians discovered the hidden story of a child within it. The photograph arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Society tucked inside a worn leather portfolio, part of the estate of Elizabeth Hartwell, a retired schoolteacher from Boston who had passed away at the age of 93. Among dozens of family documents, this one image stood out almost as if it were quietly calling out. A formal portrait from 1889, warm sepia tones, astonishingly well preserved, showing a wealthy family posed in their grand parlor. Dr. Rachel Montgomery, a historian specializing in post-Civil War America, carefully lifted the photograph from its protective sleeve. The image revealed a prosperous family, a stern-faced father in a dark suit, a watch chain glinting across his vest, a mother in an elaborate dress with leg of mutton sleeves, and two older children, a teenage boy and girl, standing rigidly beside their parents. The room behind them spoke of opulence, intricate wallpaper, heavy draperies, and lavish furnishings gleaming under the photographer's flash powder. Rachel had examined hundreds of portraits from this era, yet something about this one held her gaze. In the background, slightly blurred, two small figures sat upon an expensive Persian rug. She leaned closer, squinting at the details. Two little girls, perhaps 6 or 7, playing with wooden toys. One with golden hair twisted into elaborate ringlets. The other with tightly coiled dark hair. Interesting, Rachel murmured, reaching for her magnifying glass. Two children playing behind a formal portrait. That was unusual. Her colleague James Chen looked up from a stack of documents. What have you got? A family portrait? Late 1880s, maybe 1890. But there are children in the background who aren't part of the formal composition. James walked over, adjusting his glasses. The photographer probably didn't have time to move them before taking the shot. Film was expensive back then. They wouldn't want to waste another plate. Rachel nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the two figures. Both girls wore identical dresses, lavish garments with lace collars and ribbon details. It was remarkable in an era when class distinctions were marked so clearly by clothing. Seeing two children dressed the same, especially when one was white and the other black, was extraordinary. Look at these dresses, Rachel said, pointing. Identical. Same fabric, same lace trim, same ribbons. In 1889, that is remarkable. Wealthy families rarely dressed black children, servants or otherwise like their own. James leaned closer. Perhaps she was adopted or a ward of the family. Perhaps, Rachel replied, doubt heavy in her voice. But formal adoption of black children by wealthy white families was virtually unheard of in this era. Wards were usually kept at a distance, not dressed identically to biological children. She continued to examine every detail. The blonde girl held a wooden horse, her smile bright and genuine. The black girl reached toward a set of building blocks scattered on the rug, her expression harder to read in the slightly blurred background. I'm going to scan this at high resolution, Rachel said, carrying the photograph to the society's imaging equipment. There's something about those children in the background. Something worth studying more closely. 3 days later, Rachel sat in her cramped office, the high-resolution scan of the 1889 portrait spread across 2 monitors. She had scrutinized every inch of the image, documenting details for the Society's archive. The formal subjects identified through the portfolio's documentation as the Richmond family of Boston had been thoroughly catalogued Jonathan Richmond a shipping magnate, his wife Caroline, and their children Thomas and Catherine. But the two girls in the background had no names attached. Rachel zoomed in, carefully adjusting contrast and sharpness. The blonde girl, clearly a Richmond daughter, smiled as she held a wooden horse. The black girl reached toward the scattered building blocks, and then Rachel saw it. Her hand froze on the mouse. She leaned closer face, inches from the screen, zooming in further on the black child's hands. A small detail, but one that made the entire photograph feel alive, whispering secrets from over a century ago. They're barely visible in the enhanced image were marks, not the casual scrapes or bruises of childhood play, but something far more disturbing. Circular impressions around the wrists, dark bands of discoloration, forming perfect rings as if something had been tightly bound to those small wrists for long stretches of time. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She zoomed out slightly, then shifted her gaze to the child's legs. Where the dress had shifted during play, one ankle peeked out, and the same haunting marks appeared, circular impressions, darker than the surrounding skin, suggesting repeated restraint. Rachel had seen marks like these before in photographs of formerly enslaved people, medical documentation from the era, and the haunting images circulated by abolitionist societies to expose the horrors of bondage. These were restraint marks, marks left by shackles, chains worn over time. And yet, that should have been impossible. Slavery had been abolished in 1865. The 13th Amendment had made it illegal throughout the United States. This photograph was dated 1889, 24 years after emancipation. No child in Boston in a wealthy household could possibly have been enslaved at that time. Unless... Rachel's mind raced, sifting through whispered accounts from graduate school stories of clandestine servitude, of children held in conditions that were slavery in all but name, existing outside official records, invisible to census takers and authorities. Her fingers trembled as she picked up her phone and called James. "I need you in my office right now." "What's wrong?" "You sound serious." "It's the Richmond portrait. The child in the background." "James, I think we found something terrible." Within 20 minutes, James was at her desk, staring at the enhanced images on the monitors. His face had gone pale. "Those are restraint marks," he whispered. "Rachel, those are definitely restraint marks." "I know," Rachel replied, voice tight. "But that's impossible. This is Boston 1889, 24 years after emancipation." "I know," James repeated. "But look at them. Look at these marks and tell me what else they could be." Neither could. The evidence was undeniable, horrifying, and demanded investigation. Within an hour, 3 members of the Historical Society's research team had crowded into Rachel's office, all eyes fixed on the enhanced image. The marks on the child's wrists and ankle were undeniable once you knew to look for them. Circular impressions that whispered of metal cuffs, of restraint, of bondage that should have been impossible in post-Civil War Massachusetts. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Society's director, removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. A woman in her 60s who had spent her life studying American history, she found the image challenging everything she thought she knew about the post-emancipation North. Are we absolutely certain these aren't shadows or artifacts from the scanning process? Her voice carried a fragile hope that someone might offer a reasonable explanation. Rachel shook her head. I've checked multiple times using different enhancement techniques. I've consulted a forensic photographer who works with the police department. These are physical marks on the child's skin consistent with prolonged restraint. And look here. She zoomed in on another section of the image, showing the child's neck partially visible above her lace collar. There's bruising here, faint, but present. Partially concealed, but visible. James leaned back, expression grave. If this is what we think it is, we're looking at evidence of illegal slavery continuing in Boston nearly a quarter century after the 13th Amendment in one of the wealthiest households in the city. We need to identify this child, Patricia said firmly, her voice steady despite the gravity of the discovery. And we need to understand what was happening in the Richmond household. This isn't just historical curiosity. This is evidence of a crime, a profound injustice. Rachel, I want you to lead this investigation. Pull whatever resources you need, full access to our archives. Research budget consultation with experts. This matters. Over the next week, Rachel immersed herself in research. The Richmond family had been prominent in Boston society. Jonathan Richmond's shipping company had made him a fortune in the decades after the Civil War, transporting cotton tobacco and manufactured goods between northern and southern ports. Society pages from the 1880s showed the family attending galas, hosting elaborate parties, donating generously to charitable causes. They seemed pillars of the community. Yet public records revealed little about their private life and nothing about the black child in the photograph. Rachel began her investigation with the census records. The 1890 census had been largely destroyed in a fire, leaving a frustrating gap in historical documentation. But Rachel found the Richmond household in the 1880 census. Jonathan and Caroline Richmond. Their 3 children. Thomas, born 1872, Catherine, born 1875, and Margaret, born 1882. 3 children. The census listed 3 children matching the photograph, the 2 older teenagers standing with their parents, and the blonde girl in the background, Margaret Richmond, 7 years old in 1889. But there was no record of any other child in the household. No servants, no extended family members, no wards, no adopted children. According to official records, the black child in the photograph didn't exist at all. Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the census notation on her screen. The child was invisible, yet present in the photograph. "Who are you?" Rachel whispered to the image. "And what happened to you in that house?" Her investigation took her deep into the archives of Boston's historical records. If the black child wasn't listed in the census, perhaps she could be found in other documents, employment records, household accounts, church registries, school enrollments. But each search came up empty, as if the child had never existed outside that single photograph. Then Rachel discovered something unexpected in the Massachusetts State Archives, a private letter collection from a woman named Helen Bradford, a contemporary of Caroline Richmond, moving in the same social circles. The letters donated decades ago and barely catalogued lay in acid-free boxes in a climate-controlled vault. Most were mundane discussions of fashion, gossip about mutual acquaintances, complaints about servants. But one letter, dated March 1888, caught Rachel's attention. Helen wrote to her sister in New York, "Caroline Richmond continues to host the most elegant afternoon teas. Though I must say, her household management seems peculiar. She has that little colored girl always about, dressed as fine as her own, Margaret, the two inseparable as twins. Little Margaret adores her, calls her dearest friend. Some whisper about the arrangement, but Caroline insists the child is an orphan she is taken in as a charitable gesture. Still, I've never seen a charity case dressed in imported French lace and silk ribbons. The girl never speaks at gatherings, just stands near Margaret, like a shadow. There's something unsettling about it all. Rachel's hands trembled as she photographed the letter with her phone. This confirmed the child's existence and her unusual status in the household. The identical clothing wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, a part of whatever arrangement the Richmonds had made. But being taken in as charity did not explain the marks on her wrists and ankles. Charitable wards weren't chained at night. She continued reading through the correspondence, finding more references scattered across months of letters. Another letter, June 1889, just before the photograph would have been taken. I attended Caroline's garden party yesterday. Little Margaret and that colored girl were playing together on the lawn. I noticed the colored child wore long sleeves despite the heat. When I mentioned it to Caroline, she became quite sharp, saying the child had sensitive skin. But Martha Aldrich told me later she'd seen bruises on the child's arms when her sleeves rode up. What kind of charity is this? Then a letter from November 1889, months after the portrait. The Richmond household is shrouded in whispers. That little colored girl has vanished. Caroline claims she's been sent to relatives in the South. But Mary Blackwood swears she heard terrible crying from the upper floors late one night. When she asked the household staff about it the next day, they wouldn't meet her eyes. The staff have been sworn to some kind of secrecy. Jonathan Richmond has become positively tyrannical about his privacy, refusing all social calls. Margaret is devastated. She cries constantly for her lost friend. The child had disappeared, vanished from the household with no explanation, beyond a flimsy story about relatives in the South. Rachel scribbled notes furiously, handwriting barely legible in her haste. The timeline was becoming clearer. The portrait taken in 1889 showed two girls dressed identically playing together as friends. Then shortly after, the black child disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The marks on her body suggested prolonged restraint. But why? What had this child endured, and what had ultimately happened to her? Rachel's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Jonathan Richmond's business operations, she discovered that his shipping company had maintained meticulous records of all cargo and passengers, detailed manifests documenting every voyage, every transaction, every person who traveled on Richmond vessels. These records, considered historically significant for understanding post-war commerce, had been donated to the Maritime Museum in Salem decades earlier. She drove north on a cold February morning, the winter wind biting through her coat, wondering what secrets the Richmond manifests might reveal. The highways were still dusted with snow from the previous night's storm. Bare trees lined the route, their skeletal branches dark against a grey sky that threatened more precipitation. The Maritime Museum sat in a converted warehouse overlooking the harbour, a place where the scent of salt water mingled with old paper and polished wood. An elderly archivist named Peter Donnelly greeted Rachel warmly, stamping snow from her boots in the entrance. The Richmond Shipping Company records, he said, leading her past rows of filing cabinets and stacked boxes. Fascinating collection. Richmond ran a tight operation, documented everything down to the last penny. Most shipping companies of that era kept only bare-bones records, but Richmond, he was obsessive about documentation. What exactly are you looking for? Passenger manifests. From the late 1880s, Rachel said quietly, her voice almost swallowed by the cavernous space. Particularly voyages to or from southern ports, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. Peter pulled several archive boxes from the shelves, each carefully labeled with dates and routes. Richmond had traded regularly with all those cities, cotton and tobacco coming north, manufactured goods and textiles heading south. Here Peter said, handing her boxes for 1887, 1888 and 1889. These should have what you need. Rachel settled at a research table, pulling on cotton gloves to protect the fragile documents. Page after page, she examined the manifests tracing ship after ship, voyage after voyage. Most passengers were businessmen on trade missions, families relocating, or the occasional European immigrant continuing south after arriving in Boston. Everything mundane, almost sleepy in its rhythm until July 12, 1887. She stopped, her breath caught. She read the entry 3 times, the faded ink refusing to let her mind believe it at first. SS Marianne, Charleston to Boston. Cargo cotton, tobacco, naval stores. Passengers, Mr. Jonathan Richmond returning Mr. Charles Whitmore, merchant. Mrs. Adelaide Foster and 2 children, relocation. Also transported child Negro female, approximately 5 years of age, traveling in care of Mr. Jonathan Richmond. No name recorded, declared as domestic servant. Rachel's hands shook as she photographed the document. A 5-year-old child transported from Charleston to Boston as a domestic servant. No name, just child Negro female. The bureaucratic language rendered horror almost clinical mundane. Month after month, she checked every manifest with renewed urgency, searching for any return voyage. Finally, on August 23, 1889, she found it. SS Marianne, Boston to Charleston. Cargo textiles. Machinery, manufactured goods. Passengers Mrs. Caroline Richmond, business travel. Mr. Thomas Blackwood, merchant. Also transported child Negro female, approximately 7 years of age, traveling in care of Mrs. Caroline Richmond. No name recorded. Declared as returning to family. The dates aligned perfectly. The child had been brought north in July 1887 at age 5. The photograph was taken in 1889 when she would have been 7. And in August 1889, just weeks or months after the portrait, she was sent back to Charleston. Returning to family, Rachel whispered bitterly, staring at the words. But nothing in Helen Bradford's letters suggested the Richmonds maintained contact with any family in the South. The explanation felt like a lie, bureaucratic language masking something darker. Rachel's investigation shifted south. If the child had been taken from Charleston and returned there, perhaps someone in that city held records, or at the very least, memories passed down through generations about children taken north under false pretenses. She contacted Dr. Marcus Freeman, a historian at the College of Charleston, who specialized in African American life during the post-Reconstruction South. When she explained her findings, the photograph, the restraint marks, the shipping manifests with no names, his face appeared on her laptop screen, grave-lined with concern. What you're describing sounds like clandestine servitude, Marcus said, his voice heavy with both professional interest and personal pain. After the Civil War, there were cases more than most people realize of wealthy families continuing to hold black children in conditions of bondage. Rachel listened in silence. The story of one photograph, one child unfolding across states and decades, revealing a history that refused to stay buried. The practice had gone by many names: apprenticeships, wardship, charitable care, soft terms that sounded almost benevolent. But beneath the polite language was a truth far darker. It was slavery by another name. But how could this happen in Boston? Rachel asked, her voice tight with disbelief. 24 years after emancipation, in one of the most progressive cities in the North, Marcus exhaled heavily, as if he had answered this question too many times before, and each time it weighed a little more upon him. Because these children had no legal documentation, he said quietly. No birth certificates, no parents with the resources to fight for them, no legal standing to challenge what was done to them. In the chaos of Reconstruction, thousands of black children were essentially orphaned parents, dead, displaced, or too poor to keep them. Families were told their children would find opportunities in the North: education, food, safety. He paused, his eyes lowering. But once transported, these children had no way to prove their free status, no way to contact family, no way to leave. They slipped into a legal gray zone, invisible in official records, unlisted in censuses, not enrolled in schools. And invisibility, he said softly, makes exploitation easy. 3 days later, Marcus called again. His voice was tight, as if he had been carrying the weight of what he found. I found something. In the Charleston Police Department records from July 1887, a black family named Wallace reported their daughter missing. She was 5 years old. The report, but Rachel barely heard the rest. The implications pressed in on her like a tightening fog. "Who are you?" she whispered to the photograph glowing on her screen. "And what happened to you in that house?" Her search took her deeper into Boston's historical archives. If the black child was absent from the census, perhaps she would appear in other places: employment logs, household accounts, church registries, school records. But each search ended the same way, with nothing. As if the child had never existed outside the frame of that single haunting photograph. Then Rachel discovered something unexpected in the Massachusetts State Archives, a private letter collection belonging to a woman named Helen Bradford, a social contemporary of Caroline Richmond. The letters had been donated decades earlier, tucked away in acid-free boxes in a climate-controlled vault. Most of the correspondence was trivial: fashion critiques, gossip about acquaintances, complaints about servants. But in a letter dated March 1888, Helen wrote to her sister, "Caroline Richmond continues to host the most elegant afternoon teas. Though I must say, her household management seems peculiar. She has that little colored girl always about, dressed as fine as her own Margaret, and the two inseparable as twins. Little Margaret adores her, calls her her dearest friend. Some whisper about the arrangement, but Caroline insists the child is an orphan she has taken in as a charitable gesture. Still, I have never seen a charity case dressed in imported French lace and silk ribbons. The girl never speaks at gatherings, just stands near Margaret like a shadow. There is something unsettling about it all." Rachel's hands trembled as she photographed the letter. The child was real, and her place in the household was strange. The identical clothing wasn't coincidence. It was intentional, part of some arrangement no one seemed willing to name. But Charity did not explain the marks on the child's wrists and ankles. Charitable wards were not chained at night. Rachel read on. Helen had noticed things others ignored. In another letter from June 1889, just before the photograph was taken, she wrote, "I attended Caroline's garden party yesterday. Little Margaret and that colored girl were playing on the lawn, and I noticed the colored child wore long sleeves despite the heat. When I mentioned it, Caroline snapped that the child had sensitive skin. But Martha Aldrich later told me she had seen bruises when the girl's sleeves rolled up. What kind of charity is this?" And then came the letter. From November 1889, months after the portrait, the Richmond household is shrouded in whispers. That little colored girl has vanished. Caroline claims she was sent to relatives in the South. But Mary Blackwood swears she heard terrible crying from the upper floors late one night. When she asked the staff about it, they would not meet her eyes. Jonathan has become tyrannical about his privacy, refusing all callers. Little Margaret is inconsolable. She cries constantly for her lost friend. The child had disappeared, gone from the house with nothing more than a flimsy explanation about southern relatives. Rachel scribbled notes, her handwriting barely legible. The timeline sharpened the portrait two identically dressed girls in 1889. Then the child vanished soon after. The marks on her body implied restraint over time. But why and what had ultimately happened? A breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While researching Jonathan Richmond's shipping company, Rachel discovered that he kept meticulous records, cargo passengers, every transaction. These files had been donated to the Maritime Museum in Salem decades ago, so she drove north on a cold February morning. Snow still clung to the highway from the storm the night before. Bare trees lined the route, their branches stark against a grey sky, threatening more flakes. The Maritime Museum occupied a converted warehouse overlooking the harbour. An elderly archivist named Peter Donnelly greeted her warmly at the door. The Richmond Shipping Company records he said, guiding her through aisles of filing cabinets. Fascinating collection. Richmond documented everything down to the last penny. Most companies from that era weren't half as thorough. What are you looking for? Passenger manifests from the late 1880s, Rachel replied. Voyages to or from Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. Peter retrieved several archive boxes, each neatly labeled. He traded regularly with all three cities: cotton and tobacco northbound, manufactured goods southbound. Here, 1887, 1888, 1889. Rachel settled at a table, slipping cotton gloves over her hands. She sifted through page after page of neat handwriting, the humdrum rhythm of commerce businessmen traveling for negotiations, families relocating, immigrants continuing southward. And then she found it. July 12th, 1887. Her breath halted. She read the line again. And again. SS Marianne, Charleston to Boston. Cargo cotton, tobacco, naval stores. Passengers, Mr. Jonathan Richmond. Also transported child Negro female, approximately 5 years of age, traveling in care of Mr. Richmond. No name recorded. Declared as domestic servant. A 5-year-old. Nameless. Transported north under the guise of servitude. Rachel's hands trembled. She combed through the remaining manifests until finally she found another. August 23rd, 1889. SS Marianne, Boston to Charleston. Also transported child Negro female approximately 7 years of age, traveling in care of Mrs. Caroline Richmond. No name recorded. Declared as returning to family. The timing fit too perfectly. Brought north in 1887. Appearing in the portrait in 1889. Returned quietly without name just weeks after. Returning to family, Rachel whispered bitterly. But nothing in Helen's letters suggests any such family existed. The explanation felt like a lie. A bureaucratic smokescreen hiding something darker. And now, at last, the trail pointed south toward Charleston, toward the Wallace family, and toward a child who had slipped through the cracks of history. One photograph, one shadow of a girl, and a silence that demanded to be broken. The dates aligned with a chilling precision. The child had been brought north in July of 1887, just 5 years old. The photograph was taken in 1889 when she would have been 7. And then, in August of that same year, only weeks, perhaps months after the portrait, she was transported back to Charleston. Returning to family, Rachel whispered the words, tasting bitter as they left her mouth. She stared at the manifest in front of her. But nothing in Helen Bradford's letters suggested the Richmonds kept any contact with family in the South. The explanation felt hollow. Bureaucratic phrasing meant to suffocate the truth. Something darker lay beneath it. Rachel's investigation now pointed south. If the girl had been taken from Charleston and quietly sent back there, then perhaps traces of her still lingered, records, rumors, memories passed down in whispers. Someone in that city might know of families whose children had been taken north under false promises. She reached out to Dr. Marcus Freeman, a historian at the College of Charleston, who specialized in African American life in the post-Reconstruction South. When she told him everything, the photograph, the marks of restraint, the nameless shipping manifests, his response was immediate and grave. "What you're describing is clandestine servitude," Marcus said during their video call, his face filling the laptop screen. He looked to be in his 50s, grey, streaking his hair, his expression carrying both professional understanding and personal sorrow. After the Civil War, there were more cases of this than most people want to believe. Wealthy families holding black children in bondage under polite euphemisms. He listed the names: apprenticeships, wardship, charitable care. Soft words masking hard truths. But how could this happen in Boston? Rachel asked, her voice cracking under frustration. 24 years after emancipation, in one of the North's most progressive cities, Marcus shook his head slowly, the weariness of history clouding his eyes. Because the children had no documentation, he said. No birth certificates, no parents with the resources to challenge the system, no legal standing to assert their freedom. In the chaos of Reconstruction, thousands of black children became functionally orphaned, parents dead missing or too impoverished to protect them. Families were told their children would have opportunities in the North. Schooling, food, safety. He lowered his gaze, but once taken north, those children had no way to prove they were free. No way to contact their families. No way to escape. They vanished into the margins of the law, unlisted in censuses, never enrolled in school. Invisible. Just like the child in the photograph. Marcus promised to search the Charleston archives for anything connecting the Richmonds to missing children in 1887. 3 days later, he called again. When Rachel saw his face on her screen tight with emotion, she knew he had found something. I found a report, he said, from July 1887. A black family named Wallace reported their daughter missing. She was 5. Rachel's breath caught. Marcus continued, voice heavy. The report was filed on July 9th. Just 3 days before the manifest listing, Jonathan Richmond transporting a 5-year-old black girl from Charleston to Boston. The timing was too precise to ignore. What was her name? Rachel whispered. Sarah, he said. Sarah Wallace. According to the report, she was last seen near the docks early in the morning. The family said a well-dressed white man had approached them, promising opportunities in the Northwark education. The mother, Clara Wallace, refused. But the next morning, Sarah was gone. Marcus paused, anger tightening his jaw. The detective's notes. He exhaled sharply. He didn't take the complaint seriously. He wrote that the child had probably wandered off, or that the family was just trying to cause trouble. The case was closed after a week. A week? A missing child dismissed in 7 days. After weeks of research, the girl in the photograph finally had a name. She was no longer a nameless shadow, not a forgotten footnote. She was Sarah Wallace, taken at 5 years old. The Wallace family. Rachel said urgently, leaning closer to the screen. Are there any descendants? Anyone who might remember? Anything. Marcus hesitated. I found death certificates for the parents, he said softly. Clara died in 1892, just 3 years after Sarah would have been returned to Charleston, if she ever truly was. The timing was far too precise to be a coincidence. What was her name? Rachel whispered. Sarah, Marcus replied. Sarah Wallace. He continued reading from the faded police report. The little girl had last been seen near the Charleston docks in the early morning. Her family insisted she had been taken lured by a well-dressed white man who promised work and schooling in the North. Her mother, Claire Wallace, told the police she had refused his offer. But the next morning, Sarah was gone. Marcus's voice grew tight with anger. The detective's notes, they show he didn't take the complaint seriously. He wrote that the child probably wandered off or that the family was trying to cause trouble. The case was closed in a week. Sarah, after weeks of research, the child in the photograph finally had a name. She was no longer a nameless victim, no longer just a blurred face in an old image. She was a daughter, a sister, stolen at 5 years old and raised from official memory. The Wallace family. Rachel pressed urgently, leaning closer to her screen. Are there any descendants? Anyone still in Charleston who might remember the family stories? Marcus hesitated before answering. I found death certificates for her parents. Clara died in 1892, just 3 years after Sarah was returned to Charleston, if she truly was returned. Her father Samuel died in 1896. But there was a note in Clara's obituary. She was survived by a son, Samuel Wallace, named after his father. I'm trying to trace his descendants now. Give me a few more days. 2 weeks later, Rachel stood at the doorstep of a modest Charleston home, her heart thudding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The house was small but beautifully cared for, with flower boxes under the windows and shutters freshly painted a soft blue. Dr. Marcus Freeman stood beside her, ready to make the introduction. The door opened to reveal Grace Robinson, 87 years old. Silver hair, neatly pulled back hands, twisted with arthritis, but eyes sharp as glass. She was the great-granddaughter of Samuel Wallace, Sarah's older brother. Dr. Freeman said, "You found something about my family," Grace said, stepping aside and guiding them into a living room filled with photographs and memories. Something about a child who was taken. Rachel sat gingerly on a floral sofa, suddenly unsure how to speak. How do you tell someone you've uncovered the suffering of their ancestors? How do you give them a name and a face but no happy ending? My grandmother told me stories. Grace began softly settling into her armchair. Her voice carried the weight of generations, stories passed from mother to daughter about the sister who never came home. The family never stopped searching for her, never stopped grieving. My grandmother said, her father Samuel, my great-grandfather, spent years trying to find his sister. He never forgot. Grace returned with a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of hands. Inside were photographs, letters, and a journal, Samuel Wallace's diary, guarded by the family as something sacred. Rachel's fingers trembled as she opened it. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellow and fragile. The handwriting inside was careful but uneven, the script of someone who taught himself to write. July 15, 1887. Sarah is gone. Mama says a white man in fine clothes took her from near the docks this morning. He told them he'd give her work up north, give her a better life, schooling. Said she would send money home. Papa tried to fight. Said Sarah was too young to go, but the man laughed at him. Said we should be grateful someone wanted to help. Police won't listen. They say Sarah wandered off, that we are making trouble. August 3rd, 1887, still no word. Mama cries every night. She sleeps in Sarah's bed, holding her doll. I pray she's safe. I pray the man told the truth, but Papa says his eyes were cold. Papa says he's seen men like that before. December 25th, 1887. Christmas without Sarah. Mama made her favorite cake, sweet potato with molasses, but none of us could eat it. We saved a piece on her plate like she might come home and want it. Where is she? Does she remember us? Does she know we're looking for her? The entries continued year after year. Samuel never stopped wondering about his sister, never stopped hoping she might somehow return. He wrote down every important date as if recording them might bring her back. Then in September of 1889 a letter arrived. No return address, only a faint Boston postmark. Inside was a single photograph. Mama screamed the moment she saw it. It was Sarah, alive. She was dressed in fine clothing, like a wealthy white child, sitting on an expensive rug, surrounded by toys. Beside her sat a white girl, and the two were dressed identically, like dolls arranged for display. But Mama said there was something wrong with Sarah's eyes, something hollow, something frightened. She said our Sarah would never look like that unless something was terribly, terribly wrong. We tried to find out who had sent. The photograph tried to trace the envelope, but there was no way to follow it. Who sent this? Was it Sarah herself? Did someone help her? And if they helped her, why didn't they send her home instead? Rachel looked up at Grace, her voice no more than a whisper. Someone in the Richmond household sent them the portrait, Someone who wanted your family to know she was alive? Grace nodded, tears streaking down her weathered cheeks. My grandmother said Samuel kept that photograph until the day he died. He would sit for hours just staring at it, trying to understand what had happened to his sister, trying to see whether she was safe, or whether that look in her eyes meant she needed help he could never give. Back in Boston, armed with Sarah Wallace's name and the growing shadows of her story, Rachel began a new line of investigation. If someone in the Richmond household had secretly sent that photo to Charleston, perhaps others in the home had witnessed what happened. Perhaps some had been troubled by it. She combed through employment records in the Massachusetts State Archives. At the time, any household employing more than 3 servants had to file basic documentation: names, wages, lengths of service. In 1889, the Richmond household listed 5 employees: Mrs. Elizabeth Brennan Cook, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes housekeeper, Mary O'Brien and Anne Sullivan maids, Thomas Murphy groundskeeper. Rachel painstakingly traced each of them. Most trails dissolved into silence. Working-class lives from the 1880s often left only ghostly fragments behind. Mrs. Brennan had died childless in 1901. Mrs. Hayes had married and moved west to California, leaving no surviving paper trail. Anne Sullivan had died young in an influenza outbreak, but Mary O'Brien had married, had children, and her descendants still lived in Boston. Rachel found one of them, Thomas O'Brien, her great-grandson, a high school history teacher in Dorchester. When Rachel explained her research over the phone, his reaction was immediate. My great-grandmother worked for a family named Richmond. She never talked about it, but she left some letters. My mother kept them. Come by tomorrow. I'd like to know what really happened in that house. The next evening, Rachel sat at Thomas's dining room table as he brought out a cardboard box filled with old papers. My great-grandmother came from Ireland in 1887, he explained. She was only 17. The Richmonds hired her almost at once. She was so proud to have a position with a wealthy family. But she only stayed 2 years. She never said why. My grandmother always said Mary refused to speak of that house, said some things were too sad to talk about. The letters were addressed to Mary's sister Bridget, back in County Cork. They had been returned to Mary after Bridget's death and preserved ever since. In a letter dated May 1889, Mary wrote, Dear Bridget, there is wickedness in this house, though it hides behind fine manners and charity donations. They keep that poor colored child locked in the nursery at night. I have seen the chains on her bed frame, heard them rattle when I bring breakfast. Mrs. Richmond says it is for the child's own good, says little Sarah wanders at night. But I know cruelty when I see it. I saw enough of it growing up in Ireland. The child cries for her mama after dark. Little Margaret, youngest of the Richmond daughters, begs them to let Sarah sleep in her room. Says Sarah is frightened alone, but Mr. Richmond forbids it. Says Sarah needs to learn her place. What place she is a child, no different from Margaret, except for the color of her skin. Rachel blinked hard tears, stinging her eyes. Sarah. Mary had known her name, had heard her crying in the night. Another letter from July 1889. The colored child is being sent away. They say she is going back to her family in the south, but I do not believe it. I helped pack her trunk, and there was nothing in it but rags. Old clothes, nothing like the fine dresses she wore before visitors. Where are those dresses? Why send her away in rags if she is truly going home? I asked Mrs. Richmond, and was told to mind my business or lose my position. Something terrible is happening. With Mary O'Brien's letters and the Wallace family's records, Rachel finally pieced together the fragments of Sarah Wallace's life. She presented her findings to the Massachusetts Historical Society in a conference room filled with board members, journalists, and descendants of both the Richmond and Wallace families. Two histories entwined for more than a century now, brought into the same room at last. The weight of the truth she had uncovered settled heavily on Rachel's shoulders as she stood at the front of the room. She drew a steady breath and began her voice calm but threaded with grief. In July of 1887, Jonathan Richmond traveled to Charleston on business, she said. Behind her, the projector illuminated the enhanced photograph, Sarah's small face sharpened in haunting detail. While there, he encountered the Wallace family near the docks. He promised their 5-year-old daughter Sarah an opportunity in Boston education safety, a better life. Promises that countless desperate families in the post-Reconstruction South heard and too often trusted. She clicked to the next slide. The shipping manifest appeared cold bureaucratic evidence of a crime long buried beneath polite society. But Sarah wasn't brought north out of charity, Rachel continued. The Richmond's youngest daughter Margaret, also 5, needed a companion, a playmate, someone constant and compliant. The Richmonds could have hired a nursemaid or governess. Instead, they chose something far more sinister, someone who would be entirely dependent, someone they could control completely. Another click. The close-up image of restraint marks filled the screen. A collective murmur rose like a wave across the room. By day, Rachel said, her voice tightening. Sarah was dressed in fine clothes, the image of a child embraced by a benevolent household. She wore matching dresses with Margaret, giving the illusion of equality, even affection. She paused. But at night she was chained to her bed frame, beaten when she resisted, told her family had abandoned her. This was slavery stripped of its name but not its cruelty. She looked out into the motionless faces before her. Sarah had no legal identity, no documentation, no way to seek help. She existed outside the census, outside the law, visible only to the people who controlled her or to those who witnessed her suffering, but could do nothing to intervene. Patricia Williams. The society's director rose slowly. Her voice trembled with controlled urgency. Dr. Montgomery. What became of Sarah after she was returned to Charleston in August of 1889? Rachel's expression dimmed. This was the question she had dreaded. We don't know, she said quietly. The manifest shows she was shipped south, supposedly returned to family. But she never reached the Wallaces. There's no death record, no census listing, no marriage. After August 1889, Sarah Wallace disappears entirely from the historical record. The silence that followed was suffocating, a silence heavy with stolen years and unanswered questions. Rachel continued, her tone softened with sorrow. It's possible she was transferred to another household in the South. Children held in clandestine servitude were often moved to prevent escape or recognition. It's also possible she didn't survive the journey. Conditions for black passengers, even children, were horrific. Grace Robinson, seated in the front row, spoke through tears. But now we know her name. We know she lived. We know she was loved. My family has searched for her for more than a century. And now, finally, we can honor her. 6 months later, the Massachusetts Historical Society opened its new exhibition, Invisible Children, Clandestine Servitude in Post-Civil War America. The gallery had been transformed. Walls overflowed with photographs, shipping documents, personal letters, and testimonies. Stories not of statistics, but of children whose lives had been erased behind the facades of wealthy households. At the center of the hall hung the 1889 Richmond family portrait. But the curators had reimagined the display. Sarah's tiny figure, once nearly hidden, had been enlarged, restored, and set beneath dramatic lighting. It was impossible now to overlook her. A placard beside the image told her story, her abduction, her years in captivity, the marks on her skin, her disappearance. Grace Robinson, now 88, traveled to Boston with 15 Wallace descendants. Moving slowly, but with unwavering resolve, she stood before the portrait staring at Sarah's face for the first time, not as a whispered tragedy, but as a child who had lived. She was beautiful, Grace whispered. Her trembling fingers hovered just shy of the glass. Even after everything they did to her, she still had hope in her eyes. She still tried to play. That kind of courage. Her voice cracked. That kind of courage is something we can barely understand. The exhibition did not simply tell Sarah's story, it ignited a reckoning. Rachel's investigation had cracked open a door that historians didn't realize had been closed. Within weeks, researchers across the country began re-examining family portraits from the 1870s through the 1890s with a new, unsettling awareness. They were no longer looking only at the smiling faces of wealthy households. They were searching the backgrounds, the corners, the blurred silhouettes, and suddenly, they began to see them. Black children standing stiffly behind velvet drapes. Children holding toys they clearly didn't own. Children dressed in fine clothing but wearing expressions of fear, confusion, or resignation. Children whose names appeared nowhere in census records, baptism logs, school rosters, or family archives. Dozens appeared within months. Then hundreds. Every photograph was another stolen childhood, another family torn apart, another name forgotten until someone finally looked closely enough to see the truth hiding in the frame. The Boston Globe ran a front-page investigation titled Hidden Slavery: How America's Wealthiest Families Continued to Enslave Children After the Civil War. Soon national news outlets joined in. Descendants of families like the Wallaces wrote to the Historical Society from across the country, sharing stories that had lived for generations only as whispered grief children taken away, with promises of opportunity letters that never came, faces that never returned. Universities launched grant-funded research teams. Genealogists volunteered their expertise. The National Archives allocated funding to digitize and cross-reference previously neglected documents. A movement had begun. On the exhibition's opening night, Rachel stood quietly in the back of the gallery. She watched as visitors approached the enlarged portrait, their faces illuminated by the soft museum lighting. Nearly everyone paused at Sarah's face. Some cried openly. Others stood with their jaws clenched in a silent, simmering anger. No one walked away unchanged. A young black woman approached Rachel, her eyes red from tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for making them visible, for giving them their names back. My family has stories like this, children who disappeared, who we never found." Her voice wavered. seeing Sarah, knowing someone cared enough to uncover the truth, it matters. It matters more than you know. Rachel could only nod. Words felt too small. The portrait, once a harmless image of privilege and comfort a wealthy family, posing with carefully curated ease, had become something else entirely. It was a testimony, a wound, and a demand. Sarah Wallace would never again be invisible. Her name, her suffering, her courage, and her stolen childhood had been restored to history. She belonged not to silence, but to memory. And across America, in dusty attics and long-forgotten boxes, other photographs waited. Other children dressed in finery that hid their captivity. Other wrists bearing restraint marks just out of focus. Other names waiting to be spoken aloud after more than a century of silence. The work of remembering, the work of giving them back their stories had only just begun.